This is part 2 of my explanation for Chapter 24, Concept 210. In the first part, we discussed how we know that for a monopolist, the marginal revenue curve is always to the left of or less than the demand curve, or the price of the product, which is determined by the demand curve. So in this part, we just have one more thing to clarify, and that is, why do they start at the same place up here? Why don't we have, for example, a marginal revenue curve that maybe starts at the 6 and is maybe parallel to the demand curve and still to the left of it? That would make sense. That would still be less, the marginal revenue still would be less than the price of the product. But that's not the way the marginal revenue curve looks in this example. So the question is, why do they both start up here at the 9 in this example? And then we just have that the marginal revenue curve has a steeper slope so that it stays beneath or to the left of the demand curve. So why do they start in the same place? I like to think of this again in terms of an example. So I like to think about slices of cake, for example, because I can think about getting slices of cake smaller and smaller and smaller. But think about you being the monopolist in a firm and or a bakery, and you want to sell a slice of cake. And you only want to sell one slice of cake. So you have a situation like we've talked about where you've got a demand curve here, and you want to sell one slice of cake, and say that one slice of cake, if you come up to the demand curve, you set your price at a price of $9. So the demand or the market or the consumer's willingness to pay for one slice of cake is $9. So you know at the beginning of the day, all I want to sell is this one slice, or maybe all I have is this one slice, so I might as well set the price at $9 because somebody will come in willing to pay $9. Then when you sell that cake, that piece of cake, how much money did you just make? You made your one piece of cake times $9. So your total revenue for that one piece of cake is 1 times 9, or $9. What's the marginal revenue then for that one piece of cake? The marginal revenue is again $9. Why? Because marginal revenue is the additional amount you make from selling that one more product. And if you had sold 0, you would have made 0. But you sold exactly 1, so you made 9, which is $9 more than you would have made if you'd sold 1 less of the product. So you can see here that the marginal revenue, if I only sell one slice of cake, my marginal revenue is equal to my price, because I set a price of 9 and my marginal revenue was 9. Now, think about making this slices of cake smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And you come in, you have one slice of cake left, but you decide to sell slivers of it. So if you think about getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller towards 0, you can see where it makes sense that as small as you can get, so maybe 1 is not as small as you can get, but maybe really close to 0 is as small as you can get. Your marginal revenue for that smallest piece you can possibly sell is going to be equal to the price that you sold that smallest piece for. Now, if you remember our explanation for why marginal revenue is always less than price, as you begin to sell 1 more, so say I sold 2 in this case, now I get into that situation that we talked about in part 1 of this explanation, where we have to subtract some of the revenue plus and add some of the revenue, so we end up with a revenue that's actually smaller than our price. So everywhere past that smallest amount we can sell, our marginal revenue is less than our price. But at the very smallest amount we can sell, which if we're thinking about something like cars, we might say that 1 is the smallest amount we can sell because we can either sell 0 or 1. But if you think about something like cake, where you can get a smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller piece, the smallest amount you can sell, your marginal revenue is going to be equal to that price. And it's only when you start to increase the quantity that your marginal revenue now becomes smaller than the price or lower than the demand curve. So if we go back again to our original question, hopefully that helps us understand why they start out in exactly the same place up here. Because as we get as close as possible to 0, it doesn't really make sense to think about the price and marginal revenue for 0, right? So instead, we'll think about just as close as we can possibly get to 0, infinitesimally small, as close to 0 as possible. The marginal revenue is going to equal the price of that very first little sliver of cake that we can possibly sell. And it's after that first sliver, when we move to a second sliver, that we have to decrease our price, and now we decrease our marginal revenue. Our marginal revenue now becomes smaller than our price because of the explanation we showed in part 1. So, because of that, because the smallest amount you can sell is going to have a marginal revenue equal to your price, the marginal revenue curve, or the red line here, starts in the same place on the axis, on the y-axis or the price axis, as the demand curve. So they start out in the same place up here, but then because of the reasons that I showed in the first part of this this example, because of that reason, the marginal revenue everywhere else is less than or to the left of the demand curve or the price curve. So we know that since they start in the same place and then marginal revenue becomes smaller, the marginal revenue has to have a steeper slope than the demand curve. So hopefully part 1 and part 2 of this help to explain why the marginal revenue curve looks the way it does in comparison with the demand curve. So we know that marginal revenue for a monopolist is always smaller or less than the price of the product. So the marginal revenue curve is always going to be to the left of the demand curve, except at the very smallest unit that we can sell. So at the very top, they start in the same place, but then the marginal revenue, other than that, is always to the left of demand. Hopefully that helps. If you have any more questions about this, feel free to shoot me an email or stop by office hours.